Thank you all for a lovely evening last night, a wonderful dinner, great music, great entertainment. The Westland metropolis of Florida. Given the weather reports, we all may be spending the next 3 or 4 days together here, so just as well to get to know each other. And two preliminary remarks. One, this is listed as a keynote speech. And I think this is the first time I've had to confront the fact of making a keynote speech on the second day of the conference, because almost all of the major keys are already noted and have been discussed and are on the floor. So what I have to add will be nuances and maybe some more in-depth points. And the second thing I want to say is I have been allocated a half an hour, which is a very punchy time for a keynote speech. So I'm going to follow a little bit of Clive's message yesterday that posters often communicate more than text. And I will move through basically what is the major purpose of my lecture, which is to talk about the lessons of Local Agenda 21. I'm going to move through that very quickly for reasons I'll say, and then we're going to go right in more to the transition to adaptation measures as different from Local Agenda 21 measures. And then I'm going to do a very personal, since I'm now in the evaluation and assessment business, I'm going to do a very personal short assessment of the Clim-ATIC project as I see it now. Okay, very briefly, an overview of Local Agenda 21 literature. The theme I want to use for presenting the lessons of Local Agenda 21 is that the medium was the message. I'm sure most of you remember Martin McLuhan, the great book about the medium is the message, one of the most innovative books in communications research, where the point was that the medium itself is actually the message. How you communicate is the substance of the message, and vice versa. So in this case, I'm saying the medium was the message, and the message was involved with Chapter 28 of Agenda 21, the Rio Action Plan for Implementing Sustainable Development by the 21st Century. It was only one of 40 chapters of the Rio Action Plan, but by far the single most successful chapter of the entire action plan. It was the only chapter that ever received global initiative and activity. Why? What were the major lessons of the LA21 experience, and what is applicable or not to the challenge of community climate change adaptation, that is to say, the climatic focus? A brief overview of the essentials of Local Agenda 21 research. The research program that I headed for 18 years, which had different names but ended up with the name of Program for Research and Documentation for a Sustainable Society, provided us a unique opportunity to document and evaluate national efforts to implement the Rio Accords. We were given quite simply the mandate to monitor and evaluate Norway's initiative on following up Rio. And we did that throughout the entire 1990s period and into 2008. The results on LA21 have been summarized in 7 books and numerous reports, working papers, etc. These are available on the websites provided, and everything that I present you today will, I'm sure, be disseminated, and you will be able to go in yourself and look in closer detail at the results. There were several overviews of analytic perspectives and results. We had different projects, we had different domains, we had different approaches, and they were in cooperation with a wide diversity of public, private, and civil society stakeholders. And we list here the best single overviews in English, and they are all available for your own usage, if it appears that the lessons of LA21 are directly relevant for the further development of Clim-ATIC. We developed several major analytic perspectives that are particularly designed to transfer the results of the project. And I should say that our projects were based primarily on in-depth comparative analysis of 12 nations in Europe on the implementation of Local Agenda 21. We had a short list over the most crucial variables from the 12 nations so-called SUSCOM study, just listing up what seemed to be crucial in each national context and local community. We had a list of 4 key aspects in the search for underlying explanatory processes, where we moved towards more comprehensive theory of what made LA21 successful. We identified 4 stylized modes of implementation, which seemed to be the implementation modes that were out there that people used. They were all quite different, and they all varied from the Aalborg ideal type of what a local Agenda 21 was. And we had a set of 5 benchmarks for evaluating and ranking LA21 achievement. These were commissioned by the Ministry of the Environment in Norway and are perhaps the one single instrument that in 5 clear criteria with 5 ordinally scored under categories, subcategories, you could actually make up an index of local Agenda 21 activity in the community. And all 4 of these perspectives are thoroughly documented and applied in the sources listed in the presentation. These sources, originally sources, were also then richly supplemented by 2 further major collections in Norwegian with our colleagues at WNRI, who have been the major cooperative partner with us throughout the local Agenda 21 initiative. Carlo All was the first actually external research institute that I cooperated with as after we founded PROCES, and we have been closely working together ever since. So these are 2 books in Norwegian for those of you who read Scandinavian that are just totally devoted, both of these books, to the implementation and experiences of local Agenda 21. Now, in addition, there's a most recent summary overview by Carlo himself, a draft paper prepared to a book that is about to come out from Edward Elgar next year, where Carlo makes the transition from LA21 activity and the so-called MEEC, environmental officers in the local municipalities project in Norway. He makes the transition towards local adaptation processes. And Carlo's presentation provides an excellent bridge for discussing the possible transition from LA21 to community climate change adaptation. There have also been provided specific blueprints for a bridge. Politically, we have from yesterday, we have the presentation, the wonderful presentation yesterday, exciting presentation for some of us who have been waiting anxiously for this to come out. And some of us have followed the way the commission has done its work, extremely impressive, thorough, well-founded. That is the political basis. And they have also a dedicated website just to the adaptation problems, which is developing and will continue to develop, and which will be a major resource for adaptation ideas and plans further. We also have, I might note, that the Directorate for Civil Preparedness and Protection has launched its own website, I heard yesterday or the day before. The guidelines, the actual guidelines, yeah. So they are also up and running. And academically, we have 2 commissioned reports by the commission that went out and provide 2 extremely heavy, solid documentations of the need for adaptation processes. We have what was a kind of I think a state-of-the-art set of top-down, bottom-up indicators for trying to translate the results of climate change models down to specific community, municipality plans for adaptation and mitigation that Carlo and my colleague Ingrid Nordland did for us, and that is also available. If you want in capsule form the essential problems of trying to meet global climate change models with actual on-the-ground topographical conditions and local institutional conditions, that is the place to go. And Carlo has also published or put out an extremely comprehensive advisory on climate adaptation. It's only in Norwegian, but there will be great similarities between this and the Directorate's own advisory. So the lessons, concepts, and policy instruments from Local Agenda 21 are quite simply definitely in place. And I don't see much point in going into great detail telling you what they are, because you'll have to find out yourself if you think they're interesting or not. Are they relevant or not? Is the adaptation problematic the same? That's the next question I want to ask. How transferable is the LA21 experience? The medium was the message, but how much of the medium is currently in place and directly relevant to the adaptation challenge? Do we have a Rio Johannesburg mandate for adaptation? Well, do we have an ICLE, the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, which was the #1 factor on the international basis for why Local Agenda 21 took off? ICLE was behind the authoring of Chapter 28 of Agenda 21, and they followed up in an admirable way everywhere in the world, inspiring national partners and ministries, et cetera, to follow up. Do we have a similar ICLE in place today? Further, are the proactive ambitions of promoting sustainable production and consumption, which was basically the essence of Local Agenda 21, or creating sustainable communities, as Clive said yesterday, is a major idea of the Clim-ATIC project. Are they essentially the same as the more reactive, protective ambitions of climate-proofing local communities? And the word climate-proofing is not mine, it is that of the Netherlands National Commission for Adaptation. How essential on a community-to-community basis is the link between mitigation and adaptation? We talked about this yesterday. It's a very complex, it's a very difficult issue that needs more attention. And finally, what about the critical issue of ethics? All of these things we talk about presuppose that there is some reason for being forced or motivated to do something. The essence of the entire Agenda 21 sustainable development and climate change issue is an ethical issue. Why do individuals or collective actors or political parties or governments feel they have to do something? And here I would pose the question whether or not mobilizing for adaptation now, in this context, at this time and place in the world history, is ethically the same as mobilizing for mitigation then, in 1992, 1995, and 2000. The medium was the message, but how much of the medium is in place and directly relevant for the adaptation challenge, and do we have a Rio Johannesburg mandate for adaptation? My answer, there is clearly no Chapter 28 of a global action plan for local community adaptation in place. There is nothing similar to what we had for Local Agenda 21. There is, in fact, not a single mention of climate adaptation in the entire Agenda 21. I took the time to go through the entire document. There's not one single mention of adaptation in the sense that we talk about it in terms of climate adaptation. Nor is there any mention of climate impacts in the entire Section 4 of Agenda 21, which is the section based on the means of implementation and where the idea of adapting to climate impact should be prevalent. It's not mentioned there at all. There are, of course, the assessments of the IPCC Working Group, too, as to the vulnerability of socioeconomic and natural systems to climate change, negative and positive consequences of climate change, and options for adapting to it. But these are hardly marching orders for the mobilization of local community adaptation initiatives. It's defining the existence of the problem, and that is basically it at this stage. That's why projects like Clim-ATIC and others are so necessary to follow up the IPCC's outline. Further, do we have an ICLE as a crucial mediator and promoter of adaptation initiatives between the international, the national, and the local? The answer here again is that ICLE has initiated a local government climate roadmap, but with nowhere near the type of commitment and follow-up that they had for Local Agenda 21. You'll find information on the local climate roadmap addressed to local communities at the ICLE station, but there is no sense of mobilization around this roadmap to the same degree that we did around Agenda 21. Further, the organization has actually now lapsed into a seriously moralistic post-Copenhagen mode. They issue on their website the statement that as governments failed at Copenhagen, the onus is on us. Why is it that national governments are struggling to commit, whereas local governments have long been committed? ICLE was never an organization that shied away from taking very clear commitments into their speeches. Further, it is our demand that world leaders and heads of states commit to a strong agreement, etc., and that your agreement must open up clean pathways out of poverty in developing nations, and that nations must launch a clean energy revolution that transforms and revitalizes our economy. This type of language is reminiscent of the early phases of the Rio attempts to follow up. I remember being at a meeting in Washington one time, huge, there were hundreds of attendants, and people were standing up and they were talking about the different, and one person got off on saying that, well, China must do this, and China must do that, and China must do that. And from the back of the hall, a hand came up and they said, yes, in the back. He says, good evening, my name is Huan Chang from China, and I must tell the assembly, China must not do anything. And that is the essence of all attempts to preach the answer, to go out and say that somebody, and that immediately raises the question, well, why? Why? Because an organization says you must do something, should we do it? Are the proactive transitional ambitions of promoting sustainable production and consumption in LA21 essentially the same as the reactive ambitions of climate-proofing local communities? How essential, in short, on a community basis is the link between mitigation and adaptation? I will make my answers today, as several made their answers yesterday, that mitigation and adaptation are not the same type of project, nor are they necessarily interdependent in any one single case. In general, the types of local communities that are most vulnerable to the world, in both the North and the South, are not major CO2 emitters. So you have a complete inconsistency usually between those who are most impacted and need work on adaptation most, and those who are the clearest emitters. Further, the goals and targets for increasing adaptive protection resilience are in numerous ways, economically, materially, politically, and ethically, fundamentally different from mitigation goals and targets. And I would maintain further that they're very different in working towards them. The financial and material costs for providing additional civil protection. And I think it is very important that we focus on the fact that when we talk about impacts from human-induced climate change, we're talking about an additional increment on civil protection activities that have been going on for hundreds of years. And it's very important that we focus on why is it different if we say it's induced by climate change. What does that mean for the existing massive institutions and procedures and practices that already are in place? Finally, the economic, political, and ethical conditions for mobilizing collective actors and resources to meet these costs today are fundamentally different from the conditions surrounding the logic implementation of the Rio and Johannesburg agreements. Here I come in with another poster that the logic of implementation involved 4 major conditions. Very briefly, they were dependence on soft law regimes at the international level. There was a recognition of burden sharing. There was a focus on the ethical nature of the project, whereby the unanimous support of the UN member states for the Rio Accords was taken as an indication of consensual ethics. Growing pressures from the natural scientists as to the carrying capacity of nature and limits for growth were manifested as natural law ethical thinking. And finally, the moral principles of both intragenerational and intergenerational equity, the ethics of equal entitlement, were a manifestation of normal liberal ethics about fair play and fair distribution. All 3, in other words, ethical theories were in the attempt to move the LA21 project. The fourth premise was to coordinate strategies, action plans, and protocols through multi-level governance and democratic decision-making at the global, national, regional, and local levels of responsibility. I will maintain, and you can look at the thorough documentation that is attached to the presentation, that all four of these premises and conditions have been seriously compromised over the past 2 or 3 years. There's been a general weakening of the international soft law regimes, Agenda 21, Climate and Biodiversity Conventions, Kyoto Protocol, as manifest most clearly in Copenhagen, where things seem to have fallen completely apart, and where there is now no serious optimism around anything happening in Mexico, and where our government has actually gone away from the idea of a comprehensive global climate change regime and said we now have to work for separate agreements. Secondly, there's been a general weakening in the commitments on burden sharing and diverse responsibility among developed and developing areas. There's been report after report after report on the lack of follow-up of commitments by whether it's the G7, the G20, or other international bodies. Thirdly, there is a general undermining of the three ethical theories that I outlined. This takes a bit more work than I have time for today, but all three of the premises of consensual ethics, of scientific ethics, the whole scientific issue is now more open than it has ever been, something that most of us don't like and don't agree with, but as a political fact, it is, and it's there, and the mobilization against the science is increasing cross-nationally. Finally, the concerted breakdown in the need to coordinate strategies, action plans, and protocols through multi-level governance and democratic decision-making and local levels of responsibility has been radically undermined by the current crisis. What are the implications and the challenges? That both the underlying logic and the actual functionality of the Rio-Johannesburg project for global change are significantly weakened and currently on hold. The differences between mobilizing for mitigation and mobilizing for adaptation are more crucial and challenging than usually portrayed by either NGOs or critical academics. Thirdly, the challenge for increasing the capacity of existing institutions and procedures for civil protection and preparedness are considerable. How will the new additional risk be assessed and weighted on a standardized basis across community diversity? This is clearly a challenge that the Commission here in Norway will lead up to. As I understand it, we will get excellent sector by sector by sector prognosis, but there will be no attempt to try to aggregate this across the different sectors. Well, good. I got it out of you. There may be, in the Netherlands, they've done this by bringing it together in very comprehensive modeling and identifying hotspots where most sectors are impeded. So that's a challenge. That's a technical scientific challenge. How will the new risk be made compelling in and through local, regional, democratic, and administrative procedures? Which communities and sectors at risk will be prioritized and which not? These issues were all touched on yesterday. Who will bear the substantial new costs for both risk assessment, resilience, land use planning, and damage compensation, particularly the latter? How will the new risk be assessed in relation to liability and compensation? How will the policy goal of exploiting the positive consequences of climate change, which we also discussed yesterday, be reconciled and integrated with the goal of protecting against the negative consequences? And here there are, again, two very divergent perspectives emphasizing the one or the other. Can they be joined? What is the status of looking, for example, particularly at the northern periphery, as was pointed out yesterday, this enormous wealth of possibilities? Big questions, big challenges, not yet seriously addressed. In sum, I would like to say that there is definitely a clear need for an initiative like Clim-ATIC. It is neither top-down nor bottom-up. But like regional initiatives everywhere, it can be horizontal, cooperative, what we called flat structures in the 60s and 70s when we talked about democratic organization. It's cross-border. It has to transcend existing administrative responsibility borders, requiring new types of cooperation, new types of more ecological planning rather than customary administrative organization. It is innately innovative because it has to break new ground on how we're going to attack these issues. So it requires serious innovative practices and efforts. And it is anchored thoroughly in local identity and commitment. In other words, it goes back to the Kantian ethic of doing something because it is morally right, not because it's a target, not even because the UN or a national action plan says you have to do it. You do it because it's an essence of existence and survival. And you don't consider at every step of the way, are we going to get the money for this? Are we going to get the support for this? It's a question of survival in local identity and your own place of living across generations. Clim-ATIC has potentially, in this context, a very timely role to play. And why do I say potentially? Well, first of all, there's the good news, as I see it. You have a medium in the project, which is a trans-border regional network. And this is, again, exactly what is necessary. It may not be the most ideal solution, but my contention is that it's going to be the only game in town for maintaining progress on actually achieving change, either in the direction of adaptation or mitigation. And here I would shoot in one very interesting aspect. Nobody yesterday, if there's one thing that nobody did mention yesterday, it was the possibility of joining the regional network activities of the northern periphery with what is going on, for example, in Africa. In Africa, UNEP has established a disaster action plan with integrated climate change aspects. They have mobilized a community alliance for disaster preparation with a local climate change. There are things going on with the Hyogo Action Plan for disaster prevention and risk projection, which are very sophisticated. It's the first time in my knowledge, working in this area for over 20 years, where I see the potential of a southern initiative actually being a prototype and partner for our own northern regions. So that's the transborder network. Second, you have a serious message. The amazing evidence of climate change in the northern periphery. When all is said and done yesterday, and all the nuances that I've raised, and all the problems that I've raised, I sit back with one massive thing. And that is that what is happening in the Arctic region and the climate change consequences are without a doubt the single most dramatic evidence of what human-induced climate change is all about. Somehow this has to be grasped as the essence of what Clim-ATIC will get out. How it's done, which way it's done, remains to be seen. So that's the bad news, from my point of view. You have neither a clearly focused purpose or function. We learned yesterday that Clim-ATIC will focus on dissemination and training. But we heard already from numerous people, dissemination of what? How? If it's the science of climate change, how will this be done differently from what all kinds of other organizations, official and non-official, are already doing in terms of disseminating the realities and the bad news of climate change in the Arctic region? So what will be disseminated? Is it creating sustainable communities? Well, then you've got all of the lessons of Local Agenda 21. You won't find any single lesson anywhere that goes more directly to how to promote sustainable communities. So we know about that. Is it relevant? Is it directly relevant now? Will it fly now when it didn't fly over the 15-year period, at least from 92 to 207? And training. massive questions of training. Training who by whom, as everybody said yesterday. What competencies? Is it risk assessment? Is it highly skilled expertise in trying to evaluate risk assessment, compensation? Shouldn't then the insurance companies be a major part of the entire, as it was pointed out yesterday again, the international insurance community is an area that has been working on these issues of risk and climate change integration into risk assessment in insurance for a long time. So that has to be clarified. And it has to be made specific so that people understand exactly what the payoff is going to be. And of course, as was pointed out by several interventions yesterday, there are not yet viable operational resources in place. Whether or not they are just around the corner, I don't know. I noticed that the slide yesterday that indicated all of the possible national coordinators all had projected, possible, interested around them. So there are several people and instances that might be there and might have the operational resources necessary to make this work. That is not in place yet, and as far as I understand, there are 4 months left on the project. So, my ultimate conclusion, some keynote speeches are more fun than others, and my message recently, given the situation in the world, particularly with the economic downturn and the continual daily input of a rechanneling of resources away from climate change initiatives back to normal economics, saving jobs, saving welfare provisions, doing quite simply what sustainable communities are about. That is existing as communities. And there is no doubt that over the next 3, 4, 5 years, and the projections are that dire for a return to anything like the conditions we had 2, 3 years ago, there is no doubt that survival of the communities themselves as viable communities with any kind of resource base or job activity is going to be a major challenge. Trying to win new resources to go into buying quotas in the south, to compensating in Norway, for example, we're totally dependent on financial resources to meet our Kyoto goals. Those are going to be major challenges. I'm sorry to conclude on such a dire note, but that's what academic research is all about. Thank you for your attention.